After the Passover service, if you're like me, a lot of you probably went home and spent some time staring into space, thinking, pondering on what you have gone through. And I don't know how often we do this. It's not something that we need to be modeled about because Jesus is not dead, he's alive. But at the same time, it's not a bad thing for us, I think, to reflect on that night about the things that Jesus faced on through the night and the next day, and the realization of what he was doing and why he was doing it and what it meant to us. And I don't know why. I mean, maybe it's my own experiences and what Allie is going through and so forth, but last night was the first time, I guess, it ever really dawned on me to consider the importance of the fact that all that night and the next day, Jesus never slept a wink. Not once. In fact, as far as I can tell, he was never even allowed to sit down. About the only time that Jesus would have not been on his feet would have been when he had fallen to the ground and could no longer stand. That would have been it. It's hard to realize that. After he was arrested, where he was taken, before whom did he stand? Now, there's a point I think that we need to understand. There are 4 accounts of all this. I'm not going to try to harmonize them. I'm going to look, however, at more than one of them as we go through. I want to list them for you. If you take notes, you might want to jot them down, but they're not hard to find if you go home and want to look this up. The references begin in Matthew 26, verse 57. Matthew 26, verse 57. They begin in Mark 14, verse 53. Mark 14, verse 53. Luke 22, verse 54. That's Luke 22, verse 54. And finally, John 18, verse 12. The material that I'm going to be talking about today begins in those places and works its way through. As I said, I'm not going to attempt to harmony the Gospels, but there are some things here. I want us to sort of walk through the events, think about the events, and think about what Jesus was doing. After he was arrested, those who had arrested him led him away to Caiaphas the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were assembled. Now let me just stop for a moment. Who was assembled? Who was it that was in this room with Jesus when they brought him in there? Caiaphas, the Jewish high priest, who was probably a Sadducee. The Sadducees at this point had control of the temple. There were the Jewish, it calls them the scribes, but this is the term in Greek that was used, and they were later changed to be spoken of as the sages. These are not merely copyists. These weren't the people who just sat down and copied it. These were the sages, the Jewish wise men, the leaders of the people, and the elders of Israel. I presume part or all of the Sanhedrin were present on this occasion. And apart from that, there would have been the officers, the police, as it were, the servants who kept control of whatever was going on, or holding up this man that was in front of them. Who's not there? There's not a Roman in the room. I think this is important. Now, the reason I'm going to emphasize this is not because I want us to become Jew haters. I do not want to refer to Jews as Christ killers. I think that is an evil thing for people to do. And in fact, there is no Jew alive today that had anything more to do with Jesus' death than I did. Okay? But what is happening in recent years is because of the abuses of the past, because of the Crusades, because of what the Roman Catholic Church has done to Jews in the past, which has been abominable, that there's been an attempt in recent years to try to make up, as it were, for those things by blaming the Romans for what happened and exculpating the Jewish religious leadership of the time. Okay? Well, I understand the motive behind it, and I sympathize entirely with the motive behind it. I think there should be an end to anti-Semitism. I think there should be an end to finger-pointing. I think that we should stop all that nonsense. But we're not going to get anywhere if we're not truthful about what happened in this occasion. So who's there? Who is there is the Jewish religious establishment. The people who had particularly a motive for wanting to get Jesus out of the way. The scribes, as I said, not mere copyists. They were the wise men. They were the leaders. In John chapter 18, verse 19, the high priest then asked Jesus of his disciples and about his doctrine. He says, okay, I want to know a little bit more about you. Tell me about your disciples. What is your doctrine? Jesus answered and said, I spoke openly to the world. I was always teaching in the synagogue and in the temple, where the Jews go all the time. I have said nothing in secret. Why are you asking me? Ask them that heard me what I have said. Behold, they know what I have said. And in fact, he could sweep the room. They know what I have said. I have said nothing in secret. Now, this is not impertinent, what Jesus is saying here. It's very pertinent because of the simple fact that when you're going to take testimony of somebody, you're supposed to bring a witness in, and the witnesses are supposed to testify as to what this guy did or said, right? Not to make him do it himself. He said, what are you asking me this for? Ask the ones that heard me on this. When he had spoken this, one of the officers that was standing by struck him on the mouth with the palm of the hand, slapped him. He says, why are you answering the high priest this way? And Jesus said, if I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil. Otherwise, why are you hitting me? Now, an awful lot has been written about the illegality of Jesus' treatment. But it had to be so. It had to be so for two reasons. One, legally, they could not have done what they did, and Jesus would have died of old age. You know, they couldn't have killed him, not legally. But also, it was necessary that Jesus, in order for him to suffer everything that we have had to suffer, to be tempted in all points like we are, yet without sin, it was necessary for him to suffer unjustly. Because that is the lot of our life, isn't it? So often. Now, I suppose if we're going to be painfully honest, we would have to say, I've never suffered unjustly in all my life. I remember, for example, when my mother was spanking me once when I was a little boy. You're going to give me a whooping. And I was innocent. I had not done what I was getting the spanking for. And I told her, I said, I didn't do this. She says, well, consider this a spanking then for the things that you did do that I don't know about. My mother and I had some marvelous debates when I was quite a little lawyer growing up, so she was used to that kind of thing coming from me, and she managed to give as good as she got. So, you know, in a way, it's hard for us to say that we've ever suffered anything unjustly. But we sure have felt that we have, haven't we? We know, we say, I don't deserve this. There's no reason for this to happen to me. And that being the case, then it was necessary that Jesus suffer unjustly and have to go through this. And all through that night, all through those early morning hours, when this was all going on, Jesus was never allowed to sit down, to lie down, to catch a little sleep, to be refreshed so he could face his accusers. Never. He was awake all night long. Now, we all know, don't we, that sleep deprivation is one of the techniques of torture that is oftentimes used. You can call it torture per se, but it's one of the things that's often used for the interrogation of prisoners. And those of you who are younger don't know this yet, but as you age, you will find it out. That sleep deprivation will eventually kill you. It just will pull you down. It will wear you down. I heard it said somewhere that if you normally get 8 hours of sleep a night, one night where you only get 5 reduces the effectiveness of your immune system by about half, which is one of the reasons why when you lose sleep and get run down, you catch colds. It's because your immune system has lost a lot of steam. So Jesus was never allowed to sleep. Back to Matthew 26. Verse 59. Now the chief priests and the elders, all the council, sought false witnesses against Jesus to put him to death, but they couldn't find any. Many false witnesses came, but they couldn't get the case. The problem, according to Mark, was that their testimony did not agree. They were at least going this far with the law. You know, we get two guys come in here. This guy comes in, he says, I heard him say this, I heard him do that, and saw him do that. They bring another guy in, he tells them, and they couldn't get any two of the stories to match up. So they were getting nowhere. But finally at the last came 2 false witnesses and said, this fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to build it in 3 days. Now this seems to be the sum total of all the witnesses they could possibly put together. And if their testimony was true, which it was, he did say that, it was completely irrelevant. You stone a guy for saying, oh, well, tear down the temple and I'll build it back in 3 days. Now, you don't stone him for it. You might laugh at him. You might ridicule him. You might consider he was an idiot. You have all kinds of things you might say about him or believe about him, but worthy of death? Hardly. The high priest, though, arose and said, "Are you not going to answer anything? What is it that these witnesses are saying against you?" Jesus held his peace. Not a word. And the high priest answered and said to him, "I adjure you by the living God that you tell us whether you be the Christ, the Son of God." Now, by biblical law, Jesus now had to answer. There's a scripture back in the law that says if a soul sin and hear the voice of adjuration, it's different from us. It's kind of like swearing to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. But it's a little different in this regard. If we have all of a gang of people gathered in around the city and we do the adjuration to tell the truth, if you know and don't speak, you're guilty. It's not a question, you don't have to get up here and lie to be guilty of perjury. In Old Testament law, you're guilty of perjury if you know the truth and say nothing. So the adjuration to speak the truth, Jesus could not ignore. He was required by law to answer. He said to him, "You have said. Nevertheless, I say to you, hereafter you shall see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power, coming in the clouds of heaven." So the high priest rent his clothes, saying, "He's spoken blasphemy. What do we need witnesses for? You've all heard his blasphemy. What do you think?" They answered and said, "He is guilty of death." Who said this? The high priest was asking the question. The sages, the scribes, the priests, and the elders. Where were the Romans? Nowhere to be found. So the sentence of death for blasphemy was passed upon Jesus entirely and solely by, and get this straight, not by the Jews, by the Jewish religious establishment. Not by religious Jews, by the Jewish religious establishment. Try to keep that in mind. Someone else called it the temple elite. But I don't think that really describes it quite accurately. There is an establishment, the high priest, the elders, the sages, and so forth. And these were the ones who were condemning Jesus to death. Now the abuse begins in earnest. And remember, who was present? Only the priests, the elders, and their staff. And still, Jesus got no sleep. They spit in his face. They buffeted him. And somebody else smote him with the palm of his hand and said, "Prophesy to us, Christ, who smote you?" Who was it that walked up behind you and slapped you just then? If you're of God, you should know that. And the whole multitude of them arose and led him to Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, "We found this fellow perverting the nation, forbidding to give tribute to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king." Absolute, flagrant lie. There was no truth in it. It was dawn. Everything the religious leaders had done, they had done in the dark. And mind you, Jesus still had gotten no sleep. Matthew 27, verse 11. And Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, saying, "Well, are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus said to him, "You say." And when he was accused by the chief priests and elders, he didn't answer a word. They were sitting over here giving all these accusations. He stands there and says nothing, and Pilate is standing there listening to all of this. Interesting man, Pilate. I understand not a very good man. Then said Pilate to him, "Don't you hear what they're saying about you?" Answered him, "Never a word." And the governor marveled greatly. He couldn't believe this. Probably something totally new to him in all of his activity with the Jews, of having one group of Jews accusing somebody else and this guy not accusing back. In this case, nothing. So, Pilate asked him again, said, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered, "You said it." Then said Pilate to the chief priests and the people, "I find no fault in this man." Now, remember, all these efforts to try to implicate the Romans and exculpate the Jews have to be ignoring this. These people are right here. Pilate says, there's nothing wrong. I find no fault with this man. And the Jewish religious establishment is saying, no, 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 he ought to die. They became more vehement in what they were saying in all of their accusations against him. Well, they were more fierce, saying, he stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Jewry, beginning from Galilee to this place. Now Pilate thought he saw a window. When he heard Galilee, he asked whether this man was a Galilean. And as soon as he knew that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who was also in Jerusalem at that time. And when Herod saw Jesus, he was exceeding glad, for he was desirous to see him for a long season. He'd heard so much about him. He hoped to have seen some miracle done by him. Then he questioned him in many words, and Jesus wouldn't answer a word to him. Then he questioned him, and the chief priests and scribes stood and vehemently accused him. You know, this is not just a matter of a formal hearing with formal accusations. It was fierce. It was vehement. And Herod, with his men of war, set him at naught, mocked him, arrayed him in a gorgeous robe, and sent him back to Pilate. And the same day, Pilate and Herod made friends before they had been at enmity between themselves. Now at this feast, we're in Matthew 27, verse 15. The governor was wont to release to the people a prisoner, whomever they wanted. They had a notable prisoner called Barabbas, and they called him together, and Pilate said, who do you want me to release to you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called the Christ? Now, he knew, it says, that they had for envy delivered him. Pilate saw through this thing just as clear as crystal. What he saw was, here is a man rising up in Jewry who is a prophet, who's gathering a following, who's gathering an increasing power among the religious people and the Judaizing people of Israel, and he was a threat to the religious establishment. Pilate saw this clearly, and he knew clearly that the reason they wanted to get rid of him was pure envy, nothing else. So when he sat down in the judgment seat, his wife sent to him and said, don't you have anything to do with that just man? I have suffered many things this day in a dream because of him. Jesus had no sleep that night. Neither did Pilate's wife after she had that dream. I don't know why that happened. There's no explanation of it. There's nothing whatsoever to lay this out. But the woman came in and she said, don't do this. I've suffered because of this. And Pilate, when he called together the chief priests and the rulers, said to them, look, you brought this man to him as one that perverts the people. And I have examined him right here in your presence, and have found no fault in the man concerning those things whereof you accuse him. I didn't find it, neither did Herod. For I sent you to him, and lo, nothing worthy of death is done to him. Tell you what I'll do. I will chastise him and release him. I've got to let someone go at the feast. Now, this is the Roman judgment. I'll give him a good whipping, and I'll let him go. And they cried out all at once, saying, away with this man, release to us Barabbas, who for a certain sedition made in the city, and for murder was cast into prison. Now you got to think this through. These people knew this man was a murderer, and they wanted him released instead of Jesus. I think it's fairly important to understand what's going on here. Pilate, therefore, willing to release Jesus, spoke again to them, and they cried, saying, crucify him, crucify him. And he said to them to the third time, why? What evil has he done? I have found no cause of death in him. I'm going to chastise him and let him go. And they were instant with loud voices, requiring that he might be crucified. And the voices of them and of the chief priests prevailed. They won. In the end, they won. And the reason was basically because of politics. Pilate was afraid that if this thing got all the way to Caesar, that it would look bad for him, and he figured the simplest thing to do was to give them their own way. He gave sentence that it should be as they required. He released to them him that for sedition and murder was cast into prison, whom they had desired, and delivered Jesus to their will. So whose will was it that Jesus die? Pilate's or the chief priests? Pretty simple, isn't it? You actually work your way through the gospel accounts. Now, sure, Pilate and the Roman soldiers drove the nails in his hand. The Roman soldiers put him on the cross and hung him up between heaven and earth to die. But they didn't do it at their own behest. They didn't do it at their own will. And Pilate did his best to try to get the people to let Jesus go. The most he was willing to do was to chastise him, give him a good whipping, and let him go. And of course, Jesus still had not gotten any sleep. When Pilate saw he could prevail nothing, but rather a tumult was made, he took water and washed his hands before the multitude, saying, I am innocent of the blood of this just person. You see to it. Then answered all the people and said, His blood be on us and on our children. So he released Barabbas unto them, and when he had scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. Would God they had never said that. That phrase has been used again and again and again in persecutions of the Jews, which it never should have been done, never should have happened. And indeed, it wasn't all the Jews anyway who said this. It wasn't the Jews who said this. It was the priests, the elders, and the sages, the scribes. It was not the people out there. For among the Jews who were out there before all these people were all manner of devout people who worshiped God and who would never have thought for a moment of acting this way in relation to the Messiah. And of course, many of them believed that he was the Messiah. His blood be on us and on our children. And I guess we'd have to consider what they were saying was this would apply to is those people who were there on that occasion. Well, then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the common hall, gathered to him the whole band of soldiers, and they stripped him and put on him a scarlet robe. And when they had platted a crown of thorns, they put on his head, they put a reed in his right hand, and bowed the knee before him and made fun of him, mocked him, saying, Hail, King of the Jews. Ridicule, humiliation, total. They spit on him, took the reed out of his hand and hit him on the head with it. And after they had mocked him, they took the robe from off him, put his own raiment on him, and led him away to crucify him. As they came out, they found a man of Cyrene, Simon by name. Him they compelled to bear his cross. The reason, of course, was because Jesus had fallen, finally, at last. Probably the first time he'd been off of his feet in all this period of time was when he fell. They came to a place called Golgotha, that is to say, a place of a skull. They gave him vinegar to drink mingled with gall, and when he tasted it, he would not drink it. It's said, by the way, this is a kind of narcotic that was sometimes given in crucifixions to ease a person's pain. Jesus refused it. So they crucified him, parted his garments, casting lots that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the prophet. They parted my garments among them. Upon my vesture they did cast lots. And sitting down, they watched him there. They said over his head this accusation written, This is Jesus, the King of the Jews. That was the one thing they could nail to his cross and say, that's our descriptor of who this person is. The Jews, of course, did not like that, but when they went to Pilate and says, no, take that down, Pilate said, what I have written, I have written. He was not having any more of that. Then there were two thieves also crucified with him, one on the right hand, the other on the left. And they that passed by reviled him, wagging their heads and saying, Hey, you that destroyed the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. If you're the Son of God, come down off the cross. Did anybody know what Jesus had been saying? Sure they did. Everybody knew this story. Likewise also the chief priests, mocking him with the scribes and the elders said, He saved others, can't save himself. If he's the King of Israel, let him come down off the cross, and then we'll believe him. He trusted in God, let him deliver him now, if he will have him, for he said, I am the Son of God. You know, I think it is so unseemly for these men, the religious establishment, the elders, the chief priests, and all these people to lower themselves this way, to demonize a man who is in the process of dying, even though they felt he was guilty. Even though they believed in their heart that he deserved to die, it was totally inappropriate for them to be doing this. And I think we ought to think about that whenever we begin to demonize someone, put someone down, ridicule or make fun of people who are being incarcerated or being executed. We need to ask ourselves, what is the spirit that is now upon us that we should speak of the dying in this way, that we should respond in this way? Is this of the Spirit of God, or of someone else? Or is it of the same spirit of these men who made fun of Jesus Christ while he was in the process of dying one of the most difficult deaths a man ever could die? Luke 23, verse 39. One of the malefactors who were hanged with him railed on him, saying, "If you're the Christ, save yourself and us." I mean, here's this thief on another cross next to you, and he's making fun of you along with all these people down below. I mean, how low can you go? Basically, he's saying the same thing the chief priests and scribes are saying out there. But the other one rebuked him and saying, "Don't you fear God, seeing you're in the same condemnation? We deserve it. We receive the due reward of our deeds," although I don't think the Bible would have said crucifixion was a due reward for a thief. "We justly," he said to Jesus, but this man has done nothing amiss, he said. And he said to Jesus, "Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom." I think that's marvelous because, sometimes you wonder what people understood and what they didn't understand. And here's a guy who knows he's dying. So for him to say to Jesus, "Remember me when you come in your kingdom," he's looking into the next life. And so he has to be. And this poor thief hanging on the cross alongside of Jesus knew there was life after death, which I guess a lot of people, Sadducees, didn't, for example, believe that. But that thief did. "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus said to him, "Verily I say unto you," basically, "Verily I say unto you, today you will be with me in paradise." I won't go into the arguments that rise around that. I think most of you are aware of them. Matthew 27, verse 44. "The thieves also that were crucified with him," one in particular, "cast all this back into his teeth. And from the 6th hour there was darkness over all the land unto the 9th hour. And about the 9th hour Jesus cried with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. That is to say, why, oh my God, why have you forsaken me? Now, that's fascinating in a way because it almost sounds like something happened here that Jesus did not expect. He basically knew what was coming. That's why he sweat blood praying in the garden the night before, asking that he would not have to go through with this. I'm not sure that he really knew that in the moment of extremis, at the time right toward his death, that God would turn his back on him and walk away and leave him completely, absolutely alone. But that had to happen. That had to happen. So that he would suffer everything that human beings will have to suffer or even might have to suffer in life. And I expect there have been times many of us have felt that God has gone off and left us, that God's not hearing our prayers, that he's not with us and gone away. And maybe there are times when he isn't hearing what it is we have to say. But Jesus went through this thing as well. Just by the way, an aside, some of the people who are anti-Christian apologists argue that the Gospels can't get the time straight. The Gospel of John suggests that the time of the crucifixion was later than the 6th hour. The Synoptic Gospels say the crucifixion took place at the 3rd hour, and the 6th hour was darkness, and the 9th hour Jesus died. And they think that this is somehow very important. You're maybe familiar with the term Synoptic Gospels. The Synoptic term means seeing with one eye, and it's a reference that is used for Matthew, Mark, Luke, and that's it. The 3 Gospels that do seem to see with one eye. John seems to see with a different eye, and therefore we have the Synoptics and John in terminology. The fact is, though, I think that's not a good way to describe them, because the 3 first Gospels, all 4 of the Gospels saw precisely the same thing. They didn't see different things. They didn't even look at them differently. What happens, though, in this particular case is that they have different people they are writing to. And this is something you can miss if you're careless in reading. If you are reading along in Matthew and Mark and Luke, you may not be aware of the fact, but they are writing for the insiders. They are writing for Jews, they are writing for Christians, they are telling the Christian story and so forth. John is not. John is writing to Gentiles. And if you think about this, when you're reading John, it leaps off the page at you because he keeps referring to these feasts as the feasts of the Jews. And he will say the Jews this, the Jews this, the Jews the other thing. Matthew and Mark and Luke would talk about Israel in a totally different way. John was also a Jew, but he's writing to people who were not. So it's not a question of seeing with one eye. It's writing to the same audience and writing to a different audience and expressing things differently. So that in order to specify the time of day to his audience, John used the Roman style of speaking of it, whereas the other Gospels were simply using the Jewish way of speaking the hours of the day. Nothing really in it, but I thought I would stop for a moment and explain that to you as we come by it. Some of them standing there when they heard Jesus say what he did said, "This man's calling for Elijah." Straightway one of them ran, took a sponge, filled it with vinegar, put it on a reed, and gave it up to him to drink. And others said, No, don't do that. Let's wait and see if Elias will come and save him. Now there stood by the cross of Jesus his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Cleophas, and Mary Magdalene. These three wonderful women standing there on this occasion. Or is it four? Let's see. Mother, sister, Mary. 4 women on this occasion. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple standing by whom he loved, he said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." Then he said to the other disciple, "Behold your mother." And from that hour, that disciple took her into his own home and took care of her. Otherwise, apparently Joseph was dead. And otherwise, Mary would have been left completely alone and bereft upon the death of her son. I don't think so, but it was something. It's incredible for Jesus in this moment of extremis to be able to think of his mother, to see her standing there and have his heart go out to her. After this, Jesus, knowing that everything was finished, the scripture was fulfilled, he said, I'm thirsty. He'd done it all. And so there was a vessel there full of vinegar. They put a sponge in it with vinegar, put it on hyssop, put it to his mouth. When he had received the vinegar, he said, "It's finished." He bowed his head and gave up the ghost. Interesting expression. He gave up the spirit. Finally, the long night of torment was over. Finally, the pain stopped. Finally, he could sleep the sleep of death. And it's painful to think how hard this was for him in all of its aspects, and to have to undergo it all at a time when you not only the body is taking all this beating, the mind has taken this terrible beating as well, because human beings don't function well unless we can get a certain amount of sleep along in our lives so that we can clear things out, so that our brain can do its work at night. All this was the night Jesus never slept. The Jews, therefore, because it was the preparation that the body should not remain on the cross on the Sabbath day, that Sabbath was a high day, besought Pilate that their legs might be broken and that they might be taken away. So the soldiers came, and they broke the legs of the first and of the other that was crucified with him. The idea being that when their legs are broken, they can no longer support themselves. They fall down and suffocate, which is the main way people die in crucifixion. They came to Jesus and saw that he was dead already. They didn't break his legs. But one of the soldiers with a spear pierced his side, and out came blood and water. He that saw it bare record. The record is true. He knows what he said is true, so that you might believe. And you sit there and wonder, what? What's the big deal? You know, you puncture a body and it bleeds. Well, apparently, this was extremely important to the early church in the idea that Jesus had shed his blood. Not just that he had died on the cross, but he actually had shed his blood. In fact, one wonders that if Jesus was brain dead earlier and his heart was still beating until the soldier finally jammed the spear into him, and he then bled to death right there at that time. These things were done that the scripture should be fulfilled, a bone of him should not be broken. And another scripture which says, they shall look on him whom they pierced. And at this moment, there was an earthquake. The veil of the temple was torn in two from the top to the bottom. The earth did shake, the rocks tore, the graves were opened, and many bodies of the saints who slept arose and came out of the graves after his resurrection, went into the holy city and appeared to many. This is an incredible thing to think about. That holy people who had previously died and been buried came out of the graves and walked around the city at the moment of Christ's death. I can't tell you over the years how many questions I have had about this passage of Scripture. What happened to them? Who were they? Did they die again, or did they live forever? Did they go to heaven? What happened to these people? And my answer is simple. Absolutely. All we know about this incident is right here. Anything else is pure conjecture. Your guess is as good as mine. I would imagine they returned to the grave. I would imagine they died. I don't have any idea really, though, when you come down to it. When the centurion, and they were watching him, saw Jesus, saw the earthquake and the things that were done, they were scared to death, saying, "Truly, this was the Son of God." Now, this is fascinating, that the Roman soldiers, having spent a tour of duty in Israel, knew all about this stuff, could conclude, as a result of what they had seen, that they had just witnessed the death of the Son of God. Many women who were beholding afar off, who followed Jesus from Galilee ministering to him, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, the mother of Zebedee's children. When the evening was come, there came a rich man of Arimathea named Joseph, who was also Jesus' disciple. By the way, that isn't mentioned in Matthew's account, but also with him was Nicodemus, the man who had come to Jesus in the 3rd chapter of John, saying, "We know you're a teacher come from God. No one can do what you're doing if God is not with him." That same Nicodemus was involved at the time of Jesus' burial. He was a disciple, a believer in the end. Joseph of Arimathea came, begged the body of Jesus, and Pilate commanded the body to be delivered to him. And when he had taken the body, he wrapped it in a clean linen cloth and laid it in his own new tomb, which he had cut out of the rock. He rolled a great stone to the door of the sepulchre and left. And there was Mary Magdalene, the other Mary, sitting over against the sepulchre. You know, it's really fascinating to me, as I read through this account, to see the incredible devotion of these women to Jesus. Of course, Mary Magdalene had been demon-possessed. Jesus had cast demons out of her, and she loved him. I mean, why would she not? Why would she not love the man who had liberated her from the torment of all that she had been through in her life? And there was a whole set of women who continually ministered to the needs of Jesus and his disciples, and they, frankly, showed greater concern for him at his death and after his death, even than his disciples. Something about women, you know, they have a wonderful spirit of caring and taking care of about them that men don't seem to have. I guess God made us the way we are. We just have to get along with it. But I'm so struck by that, because then on the morning of the resurrection, the first person that Jesus showed himself to was Mary Magdalene, possibly that one woman who had been more devoted to him than any other of his disciples. It is said of Joseph of Arimathea that he later went to Britain and founded the first Christian church in Glastonbury. And I really wanted to go there. I think it was the last trip or the second to the last trip I took to England that Allie and I made up our minds that we were going to go to Glastonbury. We rented a car and bounded off across the countryside and did. And there is a tradition that the very first Christian church in England was what they call the wattle church, because of the construction method of it, in Glastonbury. It makes a certain amount of sense, because Glastonbury is in the west, but it's in the south. And at the time, they would have been able to come easily up the river to that particular little place and land there, and of course make themselves known to the Celts, who were the people who really were living there at that time. Barbara Tuchman talks about this legend considerably in her book Bible and Sword, and she discounts the story that Joseph of Arimathea went there. But she still, basically accepts the fact that there was a church there. In fact, there was a church in Glastonbury, a Christian church in Glastonbury, before the first Roman Catholic priests ever set foot in Great Britain. And in the years that followed, there was a long strain between the Celtic Christians in the West Country and the Catholic Christians in the East, that they did not do well. So the disciples of Jesus came to the end of that terrible day, and they rested the Sabbath according to the commandment. And what would have been their thoughts on this day when it was finally quiet? You know, after all that they had been through, after all the tumult, after all the pain, after all of Jesus' suffering, after all of their own personal shame, embarrassment at their behavior relative to Jesus, with their lack of courage that they had shown, they had a lot of stuff to deal with on this day, and all their hopes had been buried with Jesus. Hard to think about that and realize it. They didn't know. They didn't get it. They had no idea. They thought that everything was over and done. They had no idea of the glory and the triumph that was to come. They were winners, and they didn't know it. And here we are, knowing things that they could not possibly know, and we can find ourselves getting down and discouraged through loss of job or family, through sickness, disability, pain, facing death. Remember this the next time you're feeling sorry for yourself because of your ailments. Remember this the next time you're feeling sorry for yourself because you can't sleep at night. You know, you're there, your eyes are open. Roll out of bed and be awake with Jesus. You're already a winner, and you have no idea of the glory yet to come.